My granddaughter's voice was shaking when she called me at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and the first thing she said was, "Grandpa, I found a box in the attic with your name crossed out on it." Why would someone cross out your name? I sat down slowly in my kitchen chair, because I already knew which box she meant, and I had spent 22 years hoping nobody would ever open it. "Where are you right now, Ava?" I asked her. "In the attic. Dad doesn't know I'm up here." "Grandpa, there's a folder full of bank papers, and there's a letter with your handwriting on it, and it says something about money that went missing from Callaway Manufacturing." "What is this?" I closed my eyes. 22 years of silence, and a 16-year-old girl with a flashlight had just found the one thing that could either save what was left of my family or finish tearing it apart for good. "Bring it to me," I said. "Bring the whole box. Don't tell your father yet. Please, Ava. Just this once, trust me." There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I could hear her breathing change. "Grandpa," she finally said, "were you really a thief? Is that why Dad never talks about you at family stuff? Is that why Grandma Eleanor left?" I hadn't heard my late wife's name spoken out loud in this house in almost 3 years, and hearing it from my granddaughter's mouth, tangled up with an accusation I'd carried since before she was born, nearly broke something in my chest. "No," I told her. "I didn't steal a dime. But somebody worked very hard to make sure everyone believed I did. And I let them win, because I didn't think anyone would believe an ordinary machine shop foreman over a man like Roger Callaway." That was the moment the story really started. Not 22 years ago, when I was frog marched out of the plant with security watching me clean out my locker. It started that Tuesday night, in a cold attic, with a girl who wasn't even born when it happened, holding a folder that could undo everything. I should tell you who I was before all this, because it matters. I grew up in a 2-bedroom house with 4 siblings and a father who worked the rail yard until his knees gave out. I never went to college. I went straight into a machine shop at 19, learned to run a lathe before I learned how to drive properly, and by the time I was 30 I could read a blueprint faster than most of the engineers who drew them. I married Eleanor when I was 26. She was a schoolteacher, sharp and steady, the kind of woman who balanced a checkbook to the penny and never once raised her voice at me in anger, not even when she should have. We had one son, Michael, born when I was 29, and for a long stretch of years, life was simple in the way that hard-earned things are simple. I worked. She taught. Michael grew. By the time I was 42, I'd worked my way up to shift supervisor at Callaway Manufacturing, a mid-sized company that made precision parts for agricultural equipment. The owner, Roger Callaway, had inherited the business from his father, and he liked to remind people of that fact whenever it suited him. Roger and I were not friends, not exactly, but we'd known each other for 15 years by then, and there was a kind of working respect between us. Or so I believed. I trusted the man. That's the part that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. I trusted him enough that when he asked me to start co-signing certain supply orders and petty cash disbursements because he was, in his words, spread too thin managing the books alone, I didn't think twice. I was proud that a man like Roger Callaway trusted a shift supervisor with something like that. I had no idea I was being handed a rope with my own name already tied into the knot. It happened on a Thursday in March. I remember the date because it was 2 days before Michael's 14th birthday, and Eleanor had already bought the cake. I was called into the front office at 9 in the morning. Roger was there, along with the company's accountant, a nervous young man named Peter Delaney, and a man I didn't recognize who turned out to be an attorney. Roger slid a folder across the desk to me. Inside were photocopies of disbursement forms, all bearing my signature, all authorizing payments to a supplier account that, according to the paperwork, didn't actually exist. Nearly $94,000 over 11 months. "Walter," Roger said, and his voice had a practiced sadness to it that I didn't recognize as fake until years later, "I need you to explain this to me." I looked at the signatures. They were mine. My handwriting, my initials, forms I remembered signing, except the account numbers on the actual bank records didn't match what I remembered approving. Someone had altered the destination account after I'd signed off on the original vendor. "Roger, I never authorized payments to any account like this," I said. "Someone changed these after I signed them." "That's a serious accusation to make about my bookkeeping department," Roger said. "It's a serious accusation you're making about me," I said back. Nobody in that room believed me. Not the accountant, who kept his eyes on the table the entire time. Not the attorney, who was clearly there to manage a problem rather than uncover the truth. And not, eventually, the police detective who came to interview me 2 days later, because by then Roger had already suggested, quietly, to the right people, that Walter Hensley had a gambling problem he'd never mentioned to anyone. I didn't have a gambling problem. I had a savings account and a mortgage I paid 2 years early. But rumors move faster than facts, and by the time the story reached the break room, it had grown teeth. The company never pressed criminal charges. I want to be clear about that, because for years I thought that meant something in my favor. It didn't. Roger didn't need a courtroom. He only needed a quiet word to the right people, a termination with irregularities in financial oversight listed as the cause, and a small town's appetite for a story. I lost my job of 15 years in a single morning. Within a month, no other manufacturer in the county would return my calls. Word had gotten around. Nobody wanted a foreman who might have his hand in the till. Eleanor believed me. That part one have never doubted, not for one single day of the 22 years since. But belief doesn't pay a mortgage, and belief doesn't undo what a small community decides about a man once the seed is planted. Michael was 14. 14 is an age where reputation matters more than almost anything else in the world, and my son went from being Mike Hensley, whose dad runs the floor at Callaway, to being the kid whose father got caught stealing. Kids can be cruel with facts they don't fully understand. He came home from school more than once with a bruised jaw and a locked door, and he never once told me who hit him, because by then, he wasn't sure I deserved his loyalty either. I took work where I could find it, 2 counties over, under a different supervisor who didn't ask questions, for less than half of what I used to make. I drove 90 minutes each way for 6 years. Eleanor kept teaching. We survived. But something in our house had gone quiet in a way it never fully recovered from. Michael grew up, moved away for college, and slowly, the distance between us stopped being just physical. He married a good woman named Carol. They had Ava. And somewhere in those years, my son decided it was easier to simply not discuss his father at all than to keep defending a man half the town still whispered about. Eleanor and I stayed together another 11 years after the accusation. It wasn't the theft that ended our marriage, it was the years of watching me shrink, watching me stop trying to clear my name because I'd convinced myself nobody would ever believe me anyway. She left not because she doubted me, but because she couldn't watch me give up on myself anymore. She passed away 3 years ago, still believing in my innocence, and still, I think, a little disappointed that I never fought hard enough to prove it. That's the man Ava found sitting alone in his kitchen that Tuesday night. A man who had spent 22 years letting a lie define him. Ava arrived at my house 40 minutes later, still in her pajama shorts and a hooded sweatshirt, carrying a battered cardboard box held together with packing tape that had long since gone yellow and brittle. "Dad and Mom think I'm asleep," she said, setting the box on my kitchen table. I couldn't stop thinking about it. "Grandpa, what is all this?" I opened the box slowly, the way you'd open something that might still be able to hurt you even after all these years. Inside were photocopies I recognized instantly, the same disbursement forms from that Thursday in March, along with pages I had never seen before. Internal memos. A handwritten note in Peter Delaney's cramped handwriting. And a sealed envelope addressed simply to Eleanor, in Roger Callaway's unmistakable slanted script. "Where did you find this?" I asked. "Behind the water tank," Ava said. "There's a loose board back there. I was looking for my old dollhouse and I saw the corner of a box sticking out. Grandpa, your name is on some of these pages, and it's crossed out with red pen, like someone was correcting it. Correcting it to what? I picked up one of the disbursement forms. My signature was there, just as I remembered it. But beneath it, in different ink, someone had crossed through my name and written another name above it, Peter Delaney's. This isn't the copy I signed, I said quietly. This is a corrected version. Somebody went back through these old files years later and started fixing them. Fixing them how? Correcting who actually authorized the payments, I said, and my hands had started to shake in a way they hadn't shaken in over 2 decades. Ava, this looks like somebody, at some point, figured out the truth, and instead of telling anyone, they just quietly fixed the paperwork so it would be right in case anybody ever came looking. They just never told me. Ava sat down across from me, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. Then she reached into the box and pulled out the sealed envelope addressed to my late wife. This one's never been opened, she said. I stared at Eleanor's name in Roger's handwriting and felt something cold move through my chest. Whatever was inside that envelope, Roger Calloway had written it for my wife, and my wife had died 3 years ago without ever knowing it existed. We need to know what's in it, Ava said. Grandpa, we need to open it. I wasn't ready. Not that night. I told her we'd figure it out together, but not at midnight, not with her parents unaware of where she was. I drove her home myself and told her the truth on the way, the real story, the one Michael had never let me tell him. She listened the entire drive without saying a word, and when I dropped her off, she hugged me for the first time in longer than I could remember. I believe you, she said. And I'm going to help you prove it. I didn't know yet how much that promise from a 16-year-old girl was about to change everything. It took me 4 days to work up the courage to track down Peter Delaney. He'd been the young accountant in that office 22 years ago, the one who couldn't look me in the eye while Roger accused me of theft. I found out through an old coworker that Peter had left Calloway Manufacturing years ago and now ran a small tax preparation office in the next county. I almost didn't go in. I sat in my truck outside his storefront for nearly 20 minutes before Ava, who had insisted on coming with me, finally opened her door and said, "If you don't go in, I will." Peter Delaney was in his mid-50s now, gray at the temples, and the moment he saw me standing in his doorway, the color drained from his face like he'd seen a ghost he'd been expecting his whole life. "Walter," he said. "I always wondered if this day would come." He didn't deny anything. That was the part one wasn't prepared for. After 22 years of silence, the truth came out of him almost like relief. "Roger altered the vendor account numbers after you signed the original disbursement forms," Peter said, sitting heavily behind his desk. "I found the discrepancy about 6 months after you were let go. The real supplier accounts didn't match what had actually been paid out. I brought it to Roger privately. I thought he'd want to fix it, report it, something." "What did he say?" I asked, though some part of me already knew. "He told me it was already handled. That the matter was closed, and reopening it would only hurt the company, and hurt you, since everyone had already accepted what happened. He said, and I remember this exactly, the story's already written, Peter. Nobody wants a new one. So you just let it stand," I said. It wasn't an accusation so much as a statement of the wound. Peter's eyes filled, and to his credit, he didn't try to hide it. "I was 26 years old, Walter. I had a new mortgage and a wife pregnant with our first kid, and Roger Calloway made it very clear that my job depended on my silence. I corrected the internal files years later, on my own time, because I couldn't live with the paperwork being wrong even if nobody ever looked at it again. But I never had the courage to come to you directly. I've regretted that more than almost anything else in my life." "Where did the actual money go?" Ava asked, speaking up for the first time. Peter looked at her, then back at me. "Into an account that eventually got folded into Roger's personal real estate holdings. It wasn't hidden especially well, not once you know where to look. He used company funds to help finance the down payment on the lake property he still owns. I have copies of everything. I kept them for 22 years because some part of me knew, someday, somebody would need them. He reached into a locked drawer and pulled out a thick folder, sliding it across the desk toward me the same way Roger had once slid a folder of lies toward me in that front office. Except this one held the truth. I should have given you this the day I found it, Peter said. I'm sorry, Walter. I am so sorry. I didn't shout at him. I didn't call him a coward, even though some part of me wanted to. I just picked up the folder, and I said, thank you for finally telling the truth. It's not too late to make it right. I hadn't set foot in my son's house in over a year. Michael kept our relationship at arm's length the way you'd keep a stranger at arm's length, polite at holidays, brief on the phone, and always careful to steer conversations away from anything before Ava was born. Ava was the one who insisted we go together. He needs to hear it from both of us, she said. He needs to know I believed you before he did. Maybe that'll matter to him. Michael answered the door looking tired, the way a man looks when he's spent 2 decades bracing for a conversation he hoped would never come. Carol stood behind him, arms crossed, watching me the way you watch a storm you're not sure has passed yet. Dad, Michael said. What is this? I found something, Ava said, before I could speak. In the attic. Dad, Grandpa didn't steal that money. I have proof. Michael's jaw tightened. Ava, we've talked about this. Your grandfather and I don't need to relitigate. I'm not relitigating anything, I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. I'm telling you the truth, and this time I have the paperwork to back it up. Michael, I never once, in 22 years, asked you to believe me over the entire town. I let you grow up thinking your father might have been a thief, because I didn't have the strength to fight it. That was my failure, not yours. But I'm not walking away from it anymore. We sat at his kitchen table, the same kind of table where, 22 years earlier, I'd once tried to explain the accusation to a 14-year-old boy who wouldn't look up from his plate. This time, Michael read every page in Peter Delaney's folder in silence. Carol read over his shoulder. Ava sat beside me, quiet but present, the way she'd been present since the moment she found that box. When Michael finally looked up, his eyes were red. Dad, he said, why didn't you ever fight this? Because I asked myself who was going to believe a shift foreman over the man who owned the company, I said. And I decided the answer was nobody. I was wrong to decide that for you. I should have fought for your belief in me, even if I couldn't win anyone else's. Michael didn't say he forgave me that night. It wasn't that simple, and I didn't expect it to be. But he reached across the table and put his hand over mine, the first time he'd touched me with anything but obligation in longer than I could remember, and he said, tell me what you need. I'm in this with you now. We opened Roger's letter to Eleanor together, at my kitchen table, 3 days later. Michael sat on one side of me, Ava on the other, Carol standing behind her husband with her hand on his shoulder. The letter was dated 8 years after the accusation, 14 years before Eleanor passed away. In it, Roger wrote with the kind of careful, self-serving language I recognized instantly from that morning in his office. He admitted, in a roundabout way that never used the word stole, that he had made an error in judgment regarding the vendor accounts and that Walter never should have carried the burden he carried. He offered no correction to the record. No public apology. Instead, he offered Eleanor money, a quiet settlement, contingent on her signature and her silence, meant to keep the matter permanently buried. She never told you about this, Michael said, staring at the letter. She never got the chance, I said. It was never opened. She must have put it away somewhere without reading it, or maybe she meant to and just never did. I'll never know which. Why would he send an apology and a bribe instead of just fixing it? Ava asked. Because by then he had a lot more to lose, I said, and Peter Delaney's earlier words came back to me. The company had grown. He was on the county development board by then. A public admission that he'd falsified records and let an innocent man take the fall would have ended everything he'd built since. Buying Eleanor's silence was cheaper than the truth. Michael's hands were clenched on the table. He's still on that board, Dad. He's being honored at the County Business Gala next month for 25 years of, quote, community leadership. There's a whole write-up about him in the paper. I looked at my son, and for the first time in 22 years, I saw something in his face that wasn't distance or disappointment. It was fury, on my behalf. Then that's exactly where we're going to end this, I said. I am not a man who believes in shortcuts, and I wasn't about to walk into a room and start shouting accusations without something stronger than old paperwork and a broken man's guilty conscience. Michael, it turned out, had a college friend named Danielle Ruiz who had built a career as a forensic accountant, the kind of specialist who spends her days untangling exactly the sort of mess Roger Calloway had left behind. Danielle spent nearly 2 weeks going through Peter Delaney's files, cross-referencing old bank statements Peter had kept, and pulling public property records on the lake house Roger had purchased 21 years ago. What she found didn't just confirm what Peter had told us, it built a complete timeline, one clean enough to hand to a prosecutor. The down payment on the lake property was financed almost entirely from the missing disbursements, Danielle explained to us one evening, spreading printouts across my kitchen table like a general laying out a battle plan. The dates line up almost exactly with the fraudulent payments at Calloway Manufacturing. And here, she tapped a page, this is the account Peter flagged internally. It was never closed. It was just quietly folded into a holding company Roger set up 2 years later. Is it enough? Michael asked. It's enough to get the county to take a very hard second look at a 22-year-old case, Danielle said. Whether it's still prosecutable after this much time depends on the statute of limitations for the original fraud versus what he did to cover it up afterward, using company assets to help finance ongoing false narratives, silencing witnesses, and attempting to buy Eleanor's silence 8 years later. That last part matters. That wasn't 22 years ago. That happened well within a window we can still act on. We brought everything to a young attorney named Priya Anand, who specialized in white-collar fraud and civil recovery. She read through the folder twice before she finally looked up at me. Mr. Hensley, she said, I want to be honest with you. We may not be able to put Roger Calloway in a courtroom over the original theft. Too much time has passed on that piece. But we absolutely can pursue a civil case for defamation and wrongful termination stemming from a knowingly false accusation, especially with Peter Delaney willing to testify, and we can absolutely bring the attempted 2004 payoff to Eleanor to the county prosecutor's attention as a separate, much more recent act. And frankly, Mr. Hensley, once this becomes public, you may not need a courtroom at all. Men like Roger Calloway depend entirely on their reputation. Once that cracks, everything else tends to follow. I don't want revenge, I told her, and I meant it. I want the truth in front of the same people who believed the lie. That's all I've ever wanted. Priya nodded slowly. Then I think I know exactly where we start. The County Business Gala was held at the newly renovated Riverside Hall, the same building, ironically, that Calloway Manufacturing had donated funds toward 2 years earlier. Michael got us tickets through a colleague. Ava insisted on coming, dressed sharper than I'd ever seen her, carrying herself with a kind of quiet resolve that reminded me painfully of her grandmother. Roger Calloway was 71 now, silver-haired, still broad-shouldered, still wearing that same practiced warmth he'd worn the day he destroyed my life. He was midway through accepting a plaque for 25 years of integrity in local business, when he spotted me standing near the back of the room. I watched something flicker across his face, not fear, not yet, just mild surprise, the kind you feel seeing an old debt you assumed had been forgotten. He came over during the reception, plaque still in hand, flashing the same smile he must have used on 100 rooms just like this one. Walter Hensley, he said, loud enough for the small cluster of people near us to hear. Well, I'll be. Didn't expect to see you here. Come to finally clear your conscience about something? The room around us had gone slightly quieter, the way rooms do when they sense a story unfolding. A few people I recognized from the old plant were watching now, curious. Actually, Roger, I said, keeping my voice level and calm, the way I'd promised myself I would, I came to clear my name. I believe you have some idea why. Roger's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went cold and calculating. I don't know what you mean, Walter. That old business was settled a long time ago. It was never settled, I said. It was buried. There's a difference. And I have 22 years of paperwork proving exactly how it was buried, including a letter you wrote to my late wife 8 years after you had me fired, trying to buy her silence with a check instead of the truth. She never even opened it, Roger. She died 3 years ago still believing me, without ever knowing you tried to pay her off. For the first time in 22 years, I watched Roger Calloway's composure actually crack. You have no proof of any of that, he said, quieter now, his eyes flicking toward the small crowd that had begun to gather, drawn by the tension the way people always are. Peter Delaney has proof, I said. He kept the real records for 2 decades, hoping someday somebody would come asking. A forensic accountant traced the missing $94,000 directly to the down payment on your lake property. And there's a county prosecutor who received copies of all of it this morning, specifically regarding the 2004 letter, since that one falls well within the statute of limitations. Roger opened his mouth, and for one long, ugly moment, I saw the man underneath the plaque and the smile, the one who had looked me dead in the eye 22 years ago and let me believe I deserved what was happening to me. You always were beneath this company, Walter, he said, low and vicious now, no longer performing for the crowd but simply furious. A foreman playing detective. Nobody's going to believe a washed-up machinist over 25 years of community standing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I don't need this room to believe me anymore, Roger, I said. I have paperwork now. And unlike 22 years ago, this time the story's already written, in your own handwriting. I set a single photocopied page on the table beside his plaque, the letter to Eleanor, his signature clearly visible at the bottom, and I turned and walked back toward my son and my granddaughter, leaving Roger Calloway standing alone in a room full of people who had just watched 25 years of carefully built reputation begin to come apart in real time. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply took Ava's hand, and we walked out together into the cool night air, and for the first time since that Thursday in March 22 years ago, I felt like I could finally breathe. The county prosecutor's office opened a formal inquiry within a week. Priya had been right about one thing, once Peter Delaney agreed to testify on the record, and once Danielle's financial timeline became part of the public case file, the story stopped being something whispered in a break room and became something written down in an official document with dates, dollar amounts, and signatures that couldn't be argued away. Roger Calloway was never charged with the original theft. Priya had warned us that might happen, and it did. Too many years had passed, and the original fraud fell outside what the county could still prosecute. But the 2004 letter was a different matter entirely. Attempting to buy the silence of a witness to conceal a crime, using funds that could be traced back to the same fraudulent account, was well within the reach of the law. Roger was charged with obstruction and witness tampering related to that letter, and separately, he settled a civil suit brought jointly by Peter Delaney's testimony and my own defamation claim rather than risk a jury seeing the full 22-year timeline laid out in a courtroom. He resigned from the County Development Board within a month. The local paper that had once run a small item about irregularities at Calloway Manufacturing without ever printing my name ran a much longer piece this time, with my name front and center, not as the accused, but as the man who had spent 2 decades quietly rebuilding a life he wasn't supposed to have a chance to reclaim. I won't pretend the money mattered less than it should have. The civil settlement wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to finally pay off what remained of the debts those 6 years of 90-minute commutes had left behind, enough to set aside something for Ava's college fund, enough to feel, for the first time in over 2 decades, like the scales had tipped even slightly back in the direction of fair. But if I'm honest with you, and I promised myself at that gala that I would be honest from that point forward, the money was never really the point. The point was watching people who had crossed the street to avoid me for 22 years start nodding to me again at the hardware store. The point was Michael, standing beside me at every hearing, no longer keeping a careful distance between us. The point was a 16-year-old girl who had believed me before she'd even finished reading the second page in that old cardboard box. My son and I had a long conversation on the porch about 2 weeks after the gala, the kind of conversation 22 years of silence had been quietly building toward without either of us realizing it. "I used to think you gave up," Michael admitted, staring out at the yard rather than at me. "I used to be so angry that you never fought it, that you just let everyone believe what they wanted to believe. I didn't understand, back then, what it actually costs a man to fight something that big alone, with no one in his corner." "You were 14, I said. "You shouldn't have had to understand it. I should have found a way to protect you from carrying any of it in the first place." "I spent a long time being ashamed of you," he said quietly. "And then I spent even longer being ashamed of myself for that. I should have believed you no matter what the town said. I was your son. That should have counted for more than it did." "It counts now," I told him. "That's what matters. You're here now." He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something that undid me completely. "Ava told me, the night she called you, that she didn't even have to think about believing you. She said it just felt obvious to her that her grandfather wasn't a liar. I keep thinking about how a 16-year-old had more faith in you than I did for 22 years. She didn't grow up hearing the rumors the way you did," I said. "She just knew me. That's a kind of luck neither of us had." Michael reached over and put his hand on my shoulder, the way I used to do to him when he was small and scared of something in the dark. "I'm proud to be your son," he said. "I should have said that a long time ago." I visited Eleanor's grave the week after the settlement was finalized, something I hadn't done as often as I should have in the 3 years since she'd passed. I brought the unopened envelope with me, the one Roger had written all those years ago, the one she'd never gotten a chance to read. I sat there for a long while before I finally spoke, feeling foolish the way you always feel talking to a headstone, and not caring at all. "You believed me the whole time," I said. "Even when I stopped believing in myself a little, you never once wavered. I wish I'd fought harder while you were still here to see it. I wish you'd gotten to watch Roger Calloway's face when the truth finally caught up to him. You would have enjoyed that more than I did, I think." I told her about Ava, about the flashlight in the attic, about the box behind the water tank, about a granddaughter she'd never gotten to meet growing into exactly the kind of fierce, clear-eyed woman Eleanor herself had always been. "Michael's different now," I told her. "He looks at me the way he used to before all this happened. I think you'd be proud of the man he's turned into, even with everything that came between us. I think, somewhere in all of this, we finally found our way back to each other. I only wish you were here to see it too." I left the letter unopened, in the end. Some things don't need to be read to be understood. I knew what it said. I knew what it had cost her not to say anything about it while she was alive, likely never even having opened it, and I decided it belonged buried with her, not as a secret, but as a closed chapter, one I no longer needed to carry the weight of alone. I saw Peter Delaney again about 4 months after everything became public, at a small diner near his office where I'd started stopping in every couple of weeks, mostly because I found I didn't hold the same anger toward him that I once might have expected to. "I keep thinking I should have come to you sooner," he told me, stirring his coffee without drinking it. 22 years, Walter. I let you carry that for 22 years when I had proof sitting in a drawer the entire time." "You were scared," I said. "I understand scared. I spent 2 decades too afraid to fight for my own name. I don't think either of us gets to judge the other for how long fear can hold a person hostage. Testifying against Roger cost me some clients," Peter admitted. "People around here still remember whose side he was on. But it's the first time in 22 years I've slept through the night without thinking about that folder." "Then it was worth it," I said. "For both of us." He looked up at me, and there was something like disbelief in his expression, like he'd expected me to hold the grudge longer than I had. "You're not angry with me?" "I was," I admitted. "For about a week, when I first understood how long you'd known. But you gave me the truth eventually, Peter. A lot of people in this town never gave me anything but silence for 22 years. You at least kept the real records, even when you were too afraid to hand them over. That has to count for something. He nodded slowly, and for the first time since I'd walked back into his life, he looked like a man who might finally be able to put something down that he'd been carrying for far too long. Ava wrote about the whole thing for a school assignment that spring, a personal essay for her English class about a family member who inspired her. She showed it to me before she turned it in, sitting across from me at the same kitchen table where she'd first opened that cardboard box. I wrote about you, she said, a little shy about it in a way that reminded me she was still, underneath all that fierce conviction, just a 16-year-old girl. Is that okay? I read it slowly. She'd written about integrity, about what it meant to hold on to the truth even when nobody around you believes it, and about what it meant to finally be believed. She'd written about walking into that gala beside me, about watching a room full of strangers realize they'd been wrong about a man for over 2 decades, and about learning that courage sometimes looks like an old man in a quiet kitchen, finally deciding he was done staying silent. You make me sound braver than I felt, I told her, my voice thick. You were braver than you felt, she said. That's usually how it works, Grandpa. I hugged her for a long time that afternoon, longer than either of us probably meant to, and I thought about how strange it was that the truth had waited 22 years for a 16-year-old with a flashlight and a stubborn streak to finally set it free. A year after that gala, our family gathered at my house for Ava's 17th birthday, Michael, Carol, Ava, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, a house that felt full instead of quiet. Michael stood up partway through dinner, tapping his glass the way people do when they've got something they've been meaning to say. I want to say something, he said, and I watched him look around the table before his eyes landed on me. A year ago, I didn't really know my own father. I mean, I knew him, but I didn't know him, not really, not the way you're supposed to know your father. I spent most of my life believing a story that was never true, and I let that story keep me from the one person who never stopped loving me through all of it. He raised his glass toward me. Dad, I'm sorry it took 22 years and my daughter's stubbornness to bring us back together. But I'm grateful every single day now that it did. To Dad. And to Ava, for not letting any of us give up on the truth. Ava beamed, raising her own glass, and for a moment I couldn't speak at all. I just sat there, looking around a table that had almost never existed again in my lifetime, at a son who had finally come home, and a granddaughter who had refused to let a lie outlive the truth. I spent 22 years believing nobody would ever choose to believe me over a comfortable story, I finally said, when I trusted my voice again. I was wrong about that. It just took the right person finding the right box at the right time. I don't think I'll ever be able to properly thank you for that, Ava. You gave me my family back. You gave me myself back. You never lost yourself, Grandpa, she said. You just needed someone to help you prove it to everyone else. I think about Roger Calloway sometimes, though less often than I once thought I would. He sold the lake house not long after the settlement, moved out of the county entirely, and as far as I know, hasn't set foot back here since. I don't spend much energy hating him anymore. Hatred, I've come to understand, is its own kind of prison, and I already spent 22 years in one prison I didn't build for myself. I wasn't interested in building a second one voluntarily. What I think about more is the version of myself who sat alone in that kitchen for 2 decades, convinced that silence was the safest way to survive an accusation nobody wanted to question. I think about how much time I lost believing my own son had quietly decided I wasn't worth defending, when the truth was he'd simply never been given the tools to do it. I think about Eleanor, who believed in me every single day she was alive, without ever once demanding that I prove it to her. And I think about a 16-year-old girl with a flashlight, brave enough to ask a question nobody else in this family had asked in 22 years, why would someone cross out your name? Sometimes the truth doesn't announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it waits behind a water tank, folded into a cardboard box, for exactly the right person to come looking. I spent 22 years believing I'd lost my name for good. It turned out I had simply been waiting for someone brave enough to go find it. End. I should tell you it wasn't as clean as it might sound, hearing it all laid out now. 2 days before the gala, Priya called me with news that nearly made me abandon the whole plan. Roger's attorney reached out, she said. They're threatening a defamation countersuit if you say anything publicly without absolute proof standing up in court. They're also claiming the statute of limitations protects him completely, even on the 2004 letter, and they're prepared to argue that in front of any judge who'll listen. My stomach dropped. 22 years of silence, and now, on the verge of finally speaking, I was being told I might not have the legal ground to stand on after all. Can they win that argument? I asked. Possibly, Priya admitted. It's not settled law in a case exactly like this one. But Walter, I need you to understand something. Even if the courts eventually side with him on a technicality, that doesn't mean the truth stops being true. And in my experience, men like Roger Calloway are far more afraid of public exposure than they are of a courtroom. He spent 25 years building a reputation on that county board. He cannot survive the public seeing what's in that folder, whether or not a judge ever gets involved. Michael wanted to call the whole thing off, worried about dragging our family through another public fight we might not win outright. Ava was the one who talked him back from that ledge, sitting at my kitchen table with the same stubborn set to her jaw I remembered from her grandmother. Dad, they threatened to sue Grandpa into staying quiet, she said. That's exactly what Roger did to Grandma Eleanor 20 years ago. If we back down now, we're just letting him win the same way, all over again. I didn't find that box so we could put it back behind the water tank. She was right, and somewhere in the fear, I found the same resolve I'd buried 22 years earlier. We're not backing down, I told Priya. Whatever happens in a courtroom happens in a courtroom. But that man is not spending one more year letting this town believe a lie about me while he collects plaques for it. In the weeks after the story broke, first through the newspaper, then through the kind of word of mouth that moves faster in a small county than any headline ever could, I started noticing something I hadn't expected. People stopped looking away from me at the grocery store. An old coworker named Frank Del Vecchio, a man I hadn't spoken to in over 15 years, stopped me outside the hardware store one Saturday morning, hat in hand, looking about as uncomfortable as a grown man can look. Walter, he said. I want to say I'm sorry. We all just believed what we were told back then. Nobody bothered to ask you your side of it, not really. That was wrong of us, and I've thought about it more than a few times over the years, if I'm being honest. I shook his hand. It's all right, Frank. Most people just believe the story that's put in front of them. I don't hold that against any one person. I hold it against the one man who wrote the story in the first place. It happened more than once, old neighbors, former colleagues, even the son of the detective who'd once interviewed me all those years ago, each offering some version of the same quiet apology. I didn't need any of it, not really, not anymore. But I won't pretend it didn't feel like something settling back into place after 22 years of walking through town like a man who owed everyone an explanation he could never quite give. The strangest moment came from a woman named Susan Whitfield, who had worked the front desk at Callaway Manufacturing back when I was still shift supervisor. She found me at the farmer's market that spring, and without much preamble, told me she'd always suspected something was wrong with how quickly the whole thing had been handled. Roger moved too fast, she said. Fired you before anyone really investigated anything properly. I always thought that was strange for a man who usually took his time with every decision. I should have said something back then. I'm sorry I didn't. You didn't owe me anything, Susan, I told her. None of you did. The only person who owed me the truth was Roger, and he spent 22 years making sure he never had to pay that debt. It wasn't apologies I needed by then, though. It was simpler than that. It was just the quiet, ordinary relief of walking into a room and no longer being the man everyone assumed had something to hide. If you had told me, on that Thursday in March 22 years ago, that it would take more than 2 decades and a 16-year-old girl with a flashlight to clear my name, I don't know that I would have had the strength to keep going at all. There were years, plenty of them, when I genuinely believed the story Roger Calloway told about me would simply outlive me, that I would go to my grave as the man half the county still quietly believed had stolen from the company that once trusted him. I know better now. I know that truth doesn't disappear just because it goes unspoken for a long time. It waits. Sometimes it waits behind a water tank in an attic nobody's cleaned out in years. Sometimes it waits in a locked drawer in a nervous young accountant's office, kept safe by a guilty conscience that never quite let itself forget. And sometimes it waits in the stubborn, unwavering belief of people who love you enough to go looking for it, even when you've stopped believing it's still out there to find. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand why it took my own family so long to ask the right questions, or why it took a granddaughter I never expected to change everything to finally set the truth free. But I've stopped needing to understand it. I only need to be grateful for it, and I am. Every single day I wake up in a house that finally feels like it belongs to a man with nothing left to hide. 22 years is a long time to carry a lie that was never yours to begin with. But it's an even longer time to hold on to the people who never stopped believing you were worth the wait.